story, and with this we'll begin, that the old Rebbe gathers his Hasidim around the table and says, where is God? And they all sort of chuckle and say, well, God is everywhere, of course, up, down, right, left, all around. And we were taught that since we were kids. And he said, no, that's not true. I said, what? How can that not be true? He says, God is where we let God in. God can only be found when we invite God into our lives. Otherwise, God's not here. You know, God can't be found. And so one can theorize about what that story means, right? That could be a whole nother lesson, right? So, tell us what that story means. The way I engage in that story, and we have a moment if you want to think about that for a minute, right? So what does the story mean? What's the moral of the story? Right? Where can God be found? And the answer is wherever you let God in, meaning God is relational. The essence of God is relational. Right? So that's how I understand the story. But there are other ways to interpret it, right? One can interpret it progressively and say, well, God is a human construct. God is where we let God in. That's what that means. Or it can mean, right, I'm more of a centrist, which means that God is relational. The essence of God is in relationship. Or it can mean, right, that just in order to experience, God is a force that's exists with or without human beings. And the only question is, are we opening up our senses to experience God? Right? If we just open up our senses a little bit more and use more senses than our touch, feel, right? Because the challenge is God can't be touched, intangible God, right? So we have to use a different sense. We have to use a spiritual sense. We have to use our consciousness, right? Opening our consciousness, which is really a challenge, right? We're not taught how to do that. We do through meditation and mindfulness, right? And all these Zen yoga, right? There are ways to open up one's consciousness, but that's the issue. The issue is God exists. So that's another thing that the story can mean is spend a little time opening up your consciousness. Right? So there we go. So that's the opening story, and you can read it in a variety of ways, just like we can understand God in a variety of ways. Here we go. Here's our Microsoft PowerPoint that will travel through today. Here we are, class 8. Is that all working? We are God, right? And divine moments, right? Whenever we see that image up in the sky, for some reason, we think, oh, there's God, right? God's talking, there's angels. And that comes from our ancient past, right? So let's just imagine the world for a moment as ancients would experience the world, right? So no electricity, no cars, no pavement, no houses, right? We have like mud houses and things like that. So we are in the elements for the most part, yeah, and when we see this image, right, that's our consciousness. We are reminded of our primal past, right? And we say, oh, there's God, right? And we're inundated with those images. Societal image of that's of the voice of God, looks kind of like this. So what about it is it, right? So it's the light rays, it's the light, right, that's shining. And so that's part of how we imagine God, in light. And also from above, right? There's light coming from above, right? And so that's how our ancient ancestors, right, saw the world. We saw the world like a dome. Right, so we had a flat Earth, of course, right? And then we had a dome on top of it, which is the sky, the rakia, right? The sky. And then we have little holes in it, and that's above. And that's right. The stars are little holes in the top of the tarp, right? And the rain comes through there, and the sun shines through there, and we can see at night, right? We can see the little rays of light from above. So that's how our ancients saw the world. And so God was more accessible back then, is the point I'm making, because we were so close to nature and we knew so little about science, right, relative to what we know now. And we didn't know astronomy. We didn't know a lot of geology, right? And so we understood the world through the eyes of ancients, right? And that means God was a little more accessible, because who brought the rain? Well, God. How did the rain work? We don't know exactly, right? God does it, right? And then we have multiple gods for different things, right? And then the Jewish Revolution was one God for everything, right? And so here we go. Belief in God in the American population. Let's see if I can make it a little bigger. If not, I'll read it for you. Okay. Belief in God in the American population. All right. So here are American Jews, right? Do you believe in God? American Jews, 34% strongly believe in God. 30% of American Jews strongly believe in God. 28% do not believe. And then the other third believe, but not certain. Right? So it's about one third, one third, one third. Strongly believe, do not believe, sort of believe. And here's Christians. Strongly believe in God, 78%, double, right, the amount of Jews. Sort of believe is 20%. Do not believe, I think that's 2%. You can't really be a Christian, is the point, and not believe, right? That's the whole point of Christianity, is believing, right? Whereas in Judaism, a third of it is about believing, right? But then there's another whole 2/3 out there, which is about community and values and justice, right? And learning and education and matzo ball soup, right? Right? Lots of ways of being Jewish, serving on boards, making the world a better place. But for Christianity, belief is, a good 80% of what it means to be. I know I'm mixing some stats here, but you get the point. American non-religious. So American non-religious people, just your average, just American who doesn't have a religion. So do you believe in God as an American? 30% strongly believe in God, just as American patriots. 30% do not believe in God. And then the other 38% believe, but less certain. That's interesting, right? So the American Jews are almost the same as American non-religious folks in terms of their belief, for regular Americans, I guess in terms of our beliefs, statistically speaking. And the difference between Judaism and Christianity here is that you can be a Jew without believing in God. And you can still be a Jew, and you're still Jewish, completely Jewish for all intents and purposes, without believing in God at all. You're also completely Jewish, which is different than Christianity, right? You're a fallen Christian once you don't believe. Right? And so here we go. This is not a new phenomenon. We've always been wrestling with God. We've wrestling. Are you there? Do you exist? What do you want from us? And that was from the very beginning. And Jacob was left alone. Here's the quote from Genesis. Jacob, our ancestor, led a interesting life. He was a journeyman, which means he started out, right, at home, right, Yaakov and Esav, with his evil brother Esav, right, the way that the rabbis contextualize it. And he duped him, right? He duped Esav into selling him the birthright. and he was manipulative with his father's blessing, right? Inspired by, guided by his mother in order for him to receive the birthright, and he did. He received the birthright, but he did it. He had to manipulate. He had to be deceitful. He had to deceive in order for him to get the birthright. And it comes back to haunt him. He goes to work for Lavan, and wouldn't you know it, Lavan deceives him, right? The trickster gets tricked, right? And experiences some karma, some divine justice. And Jacob had to grow, had to learn how to be straightforward. And he had to wrestle with that part of himself. And he had to go deep. And so before he could reconcile with his brother Esau 40 years later, he had to go through a transition. He had to go through come to God moment. And here it is. And Jacob was left alone. He sent his family across the river to go greet his brother Esau, and he stayed alone. And a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he wrenched Jacob's hip at its socket, so that the socket of his hip was strained as he wrestled with him. And Jacob got a broken hip, and he said, "Let me go, for dawn is breaking." He answered, "I will not let you go until you bless me." He said the other, "What is your name?" He replied, "Jacob." He said, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Yisrael, for you have wrestled with God and man, and you have prevailed." Jacob said, "Tell me your name." He said, "You must not ask me my name." And he took leave of him there. So Jacob named the place Peniel, meaning I have encountered God face to face, yet my life has been preserved. So Jacob wrestles with an angel, and here's a depiction, artistic representation of two men kind of wrestling in a figure eight wrestle position. I think the strange thing is, some people interpret this as his own internal wrestling match. And I think that's sort of what the picture is. He's wrestling with his own consciousness. He's wrestling with his own sense of justice. He was wrestling with God, right? He was up there in the upper realms of spirituality, in a vision state with God, wrestling. Right? And so that's what we are all called upon to do. Your name is now Yisrael, the one who wrestles with God. So we're not the name given to Jacob. The name of the Jewish people is Bnei Yisrael. We are the children of Israel, Israelites, meaning wrestlers with God. Wrestlers with God. And that's where our name comes from. So each of our co-religionists have names that signify who they are, right? So Islam is submission, submitter to God. Christian is follower of God. And Yisrael is a wrestler with God. Any clarifications, questions, reflections, issues with the translations here? Good. All right. So it makes sense to me. So Islam is about submission to the will of Allah. And so we need to learn how to submit our will, right? And no longer have the free will, that instinct, but rather submit to the greater good, right? So, and trying to put it, as much as I don't know that much about Islam, but there you go. Christian is a follower of God, a believer in Christ. And that's the path towards salvation, through your belief that Jesus is the Savior. Do you believe? Yes, I believe. Right? That's the essence there. And Yisrael is the wrestler with God. Right? And now is a great time to consider wrestling with God. We ask the 4 questions. Right? We don't just sit passively and submit and follow. We are wrestlers. We engage. We question. We ask. We discuss. We decide. We partner. We dance, and we wrestle. There we go. So, yes, I think the question is strengths and weaknesses. That's us, right? So which one's better? They're different. They're different, right? They're all different paths, different disciplines, different approaches, and this is ours. Ours is defined by wrestling, defined by trying to figure stuff out, by curiosity, right, and engagement, and questions and answers, and debate, and inconclusive, right? It's a wrestling match that continues. It hasn't stopped, right? We're still wrestling. So fine. So what is it? What are the ground rules? What are we expected to believe, if anything? And the Shema Yisrael pretty much capsulizes who we are and what we are, right? And we know this because it's our credo of faith. It's what we say in the morning. It's what we say at night. It's what we're supposed to say all day long. We say it on our deathbed. We say it on our pillow at night. God is one. So God is one. Adonai Echad. That's one of the keys, that Adonai is one, right? So whatever that means, we know, right, through history, historically speaking, it means and not two. God is one, not two or three or four or five. But we don't live in a world really that has a lot of idol worship around explicitly. And so that's sort of unhelpful at some level. To understand God isn't, we don't have multiple gods, although there are faiths, of course, around that have multiple gods. But we don't have a lot of exposure to them. So God being one isn't so significant for us. So what could it mean? It can mean a lot of things. One of them is the world makes sense. Right? Do you understand how that could imply that? Right? God is one. There's no battling gods creating chaos in the cosmos. There's one God, and that means there's order, and that means there's reason, and security at some level, because God is one, right? So that's there's a lot of contemporary implications to oneness and wholeness, right? Beyond singularity. There's also wholeness, right? And order. God is both, and then here's another one, right? Shema Yisrael, Eloheinu Adonai Echad. The Eloheinu and the Shema part. Shema is really imminent. Shema means here. Listen up. Shema, listen. Lend me your ear. It's like a close. It implies proximity, and imminence is the point here. That Shema, God is involved with us, can talk to us communicate with us. Right? That's the Shema part, and then the Adonai Eloheinu part is the bigger than us. Adonai Eloheinu, like our God, right? Adonai, that's like big. So God is one. The world makes sense. There's some underlying order to the chaos that's on the surface, right? And then God is both transcendent. God is both creator and cosmic master of the cosmos, and imminent, and friend, and healer, and redeemer. So that's here and now. And so both far and near is the point of the Shema. So in poetry, that also comes out. It's a quick way of doing that, and then requires a lot of interpretation. That the Shema Yisrael, right, implies three things. It implies a unity, a cosmic unity. It implies our complex relationship with God, our dual relationship with God, which is both as close confidant and master of the universe. And so that's the implication of the Shema, of those three things. And so let's look at the implication of imminent and transcendent, right? Transcendent and imminent. God is above all, above time and space. So that's the transcendence. And then the imminence, of course, is God cares about me and knows me personally. So the Adon Olam, which is ends our Shabbat morning and festival morning services, which Adon Olam. We have many friendly tunes to the Adon Olam because it's poetic and it has rhyme and meter. And so let's look at the poetry for a moment. Does the English try to? Yeah, so the English tries to preserve some of the poetry. And so it sacrifices accuracy for the sake of poetry, right? So that it rhymes. So here we go. The Eternal One ruled before the birth of every living thing. When God made all according to his will, then God was known as King. So this is obviously, right, we're in big space, every living thing. When all is ended, God will reign alone in awesome majesty. God was, God is, and God will be, glorious for all eternity. Peerless and unique is God, with none at all to be compared. Right, that's another way of interpreting Shema Yisrael Adonai Echad, right? Adonai Echad is Adonai is singular. There's nothing that we can compare God to. So we can never fully comprehend God with our human minds. Right? There's nothing we can compare God to. God is singular. Adonai Echad is another way. Peerless and unique is God. Right? Hu Echad, the Ein Sheni. God is one and singular and can't be compared to anything else. Beginningless and endless too, God's vast dominion isn't shared. God is singular in scope. The scope of God is singular because it's all. So that's transcendence, right? God is above all and distant. And then the poem continues, Ve and Hu Eli, and he's my God and my Redeemer, my refuge in times. Isn't that amazing? That like the same God that is above all time and space is also my God and my Redeemer, my refuge in times of struggle, my support and my shelter, the one who fills my cup when I call. Into God's palm I place my spirit. When I wake and when I sleep, God is with me, body and soul. God is with me, and I'm not afraid. Right? So obviously, I don't think I need that. So someone is afraid, right? The author of this is afraid, right? And this is a way to calm them down, right? And to remind themselves that the same God that, like, when I look out at the ocean and see eternity on the horizon, that's the same God that, like, took me out of Egypt and I can daven to whenever I want. So that's the Adon Olam comfort, right? That's the same God, right? Oh my God, like the same God. When I look up and like imagine astronomy and there's a moon and there's other stars floating around just like ours, right? And like that's that God, that thing is also here with me. And that's a beautiful thought, right? And a very Jewish expression of God. That dare I say dual? It's hard to say dual and God in the same breath, but we can experience God in two different ways. Right? We can experience God as cosmic and personal, and that's a way to access God, right? Is to remind ourselves of that duality. So speaking of duality, there's so many names of God. God doesn't have just one name. God has, right? And when we love something, we give it multiple names. Right? And when we deal with it a lot, right? When we're appreciating it and acknowledging it and using it, something, right? We have a lot of names for it. Right? We all know that, right? The Eskimos have, right, 49 different categories of snow, right? Because they need it for so many different things. So that, right, we have like powder and wet snow. That's what we have, right? But they have like 50 different, because they need snow, they work with it. So when you're dealing with God and when you're immersed in God, you're going to have a lot of names for God. And so here are some of them that we commonly use. So here's the list. So as we go through, write a couple down, get a pen ready or your iPhone and write a couple down. And they're asking for ones that you like, ones that you'd say, no, that just does not work for me. And then a question mark, which you just don't understand. Like, how is that the name of God? Yeah, how did that happen? All right, so here's a couple. Adonai, my Lord. Eloheinu, our God. Kadosh Baruch Hu is Holy Blessed One. I like that one. Holy Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy Blessed One. Avinu, our Father. And some machzorim and some prayer books translate that as our parent or our ancestor. Hagadol, the Great One. El Norah, terrifying one. El Elyon, highest God. That's interesting, right? Right. How about that? Like that's a little complex, because the name of God contains within it an acknowledgement that there may be other gods. Right? El Elyon is the highest God. Right. And there's also a prayer, right, that shows that we've been dealing with attacks on monotheism for a long time. Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai. Right? Who are you, God, among the gods? You're the best God, El Elyon. So that sentiment exists in primordial Judaism because we had a hard time getting rid of this idea that there are other gods around. Right? We said ours is the best God, acknowledging that there are other gods around. Right? But that's still part of our historical language when referring to God, is God's comparison to other gods. El Elyon is one of those. Eli, my God, Yedid Nefesh is beautiful. My soulmate. We call God soulmate. In that romantic poem called Yedid Nefesh, we sing on Friday nights, soulmate, and it's a love poem to a lover. Right? Is another name for God here, soulmate. A king. My king has a long history. We can talk about that for a long time, right? It's that monarchy, right? When we're living in a monarchy, it's easy to remember. It's easy to relate to what it means to have a king, but we don't even know what it means to have a king, right? So it's hard for us to call God king. Right? So I've been avoiding that image for myself for quite some time, which is hard because there's a lot of it in Judaism because we lived with kings for a long time in our history. But now in America, of course, we don't like kings, right? We overthrow monarchies. And so it's really a very complicated name for God. And we think that when we think king, we usually think bad king, evil king, because that's in our consciousness. But there are many benevolent and wonderful kings, right, throughout Jewish history and world history that we don't focus on, right? So it's complicated. But Melech is in there, king of all kings, my rock, and you can read the rest to yourself, right? Here they are, the creator, the name, Hashem, right? Hashem is the name, right? Because we don't want to say the name of God. We want to protect and put a fence around the name of God, so we just say the name. So that's Hashem. Is number 16. Ein Sof is an interesting one too, number 20, which is the infinite. Ein Sof, the infinite, right, which is a Kabbalistic name of God. Rifa'enu, our healer, so that when we're praying for healing, we remind ourselves that God is a source of healing, right? And now that we're beginning to expand our sense of the possibilities of what God can be, right? So God as healer becomes less far-fetched than, right? We're not saying God as doctor, right? We're saying God as healer, God that cosmically has provided healing in this universe, right? And healing All you need is time, and for many things, and that heals. And so God, as timeless healer, right, becomes more accessible to the modern mind when we expand our view, a perspective of what God can be. And there's because there's so many names, right? Eheyeh, Asher Eyeh, becoming. God is that which becomes. Eheyeh, Asher Eheyeh, right? So that at the burning bush, um, God, Moses demands a name for God, and God says, "No, I don't have a name. There's no name. I am what I am. There's no name for me." And he says, "No, I need a name. What's the name that we can call you?" And ultimately, he says, at the burning bush, God says, Eheyeh, Asher Eheyeh. I will be what I will be. That's my name. You want to call me something? I am. I become. I am. That's who I. That's my name. Right? And that's Eheyeh, right? Becoming, right? Mi she'amar v'heya olam, right? So the one who spoke the world into being, the one who like thought of this world and spoke it and said, let there be light, and there was light. That's God, right? So all these are just ways to understand God, ways that we call God's presence and invoke God's presence through all these different ways, right? Our shepherd, right? When we were agrarian, and the shepherd took care of the sheep. The shepherd, was responsible for those sheep, and we say, "You are responsible for us, God," just like those shepherds are responsible for their sheep. El Emunah, reliable one. Adonai Tzevaot, master of armies, right? When we need might, we look to God of strength and power, and we say, Adonai Tzevaot, come and help us against our enemies. Avinu Shabashamayim, right? Our Father in heaven, we look to God as a parent. It's like a child looks on a parent. We look to you, God. And then we have more ethereal names of God. We've got the breath of life, the breath of all life, consciousness, right? The breath of all life means, right? That which animates all is God. God is life, is that but electricity of life. Ribono Shel Olam, I use that one a lot in my personal prayers when I'm praying from the pulpit. Ribono Shel Olam, and I say source of all. That's my favorite name for God right now. Stuck with me for past 5 or 6 years. Source of all. And then I use Ribono Shel Olam, which for me is kind of harkens back through religious tradition in the Hebrew language, of course, but also kind of a Yiddish expression. Ribono Shel Olam is a Yiddish expression that our ancestors would use. And so together, those help me. The Yiddish ancestry, I'm an Ashkenazi Jew, and the source of all, which is sort of the most universal cosmic name I could find, that source of all. So that helps me, but right, we can call upon God, and prayers do this, right? When an author writes a prayer, they use the name of God that they want to access. They use the name of God that they call upon God in the way that they need. Does that make sense? Right? You are my God of healing. You are my God of strength. You are my God of might. You are my God of infinity. I need to remind myself that, right, infinity exists. There's a lot out there, beyond us. Here we go. So we're in the world of theology now, right? And so what is God, right? So right, I'm questioning the static nature of God, right? God can morph and be, and so how do we, what do we grab hold of? And so here's That's the Jewish problem, right? There's strengths, talk about strengths and weaknesses, right? One of the weaknesses is we can't hold on to God. Like we can't hold on. We can't like, how do we grasp God? Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, God's speech at the mountain of Sinai, in Sinai. Here's what happened. When we had ultimate revelation at Sinai, God's speech, God talked to us. It's one time God like talked to a community of people, communicated in this powerful moment. And here's how it worked, according to Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina. And note that it's ascribed to a person. This isn't like gospel. This is not ultimate truth. This is a sage telling us his opinion, right? And that's how Jewish tradition generally gets transmitted, right? A sage by sage, which means not by ultimate credo or truth, not by a belief system, but by opinion, right? Here's an opinion that we should consider. Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina said that it would be good for us to consider. God's speech came to every individual according to their capacity. God's speech, right? How did God's speech arrive to us? How did God communicate to us? God's speech came to every individual according to their capacity. Whatever capacity we had, that's how God communicated to us. And don't be surprised by this, right? That was the tradition in the desert. Like the desert was a supernatural place that like stuff happened. When the manna descended for Israel, it tasted differently to everyone, right? So it also, right, we have this tradition that, right, that can happen. You know, we can have one stimulus and people receive the data differently, right? Imagine that, right? We have one thing happens and different people can interpret it and understand it and receive it in a different way. That's what happened at Sinai, and it also happened to the man. Right? It happened before, so we shouldn't be that surprised. Says Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina. To the infants, the man tasted like mother's milk. To the young, the man tastes like bread and oil and honey. To the elders, it tasted like wafers made of honey, which is what they preferred back in the day, apparently. In the same way that manna tasted differently in everyone's mouth, according to their uniqueness, so each individual heard God's speech according to their uniqueness. Right? God was completely intelligible to every person there because somehow, right, supernaturally, the transmission, right? God transmitted, and then all the receivers received it in their own way, the best way possible for their own uniqueness. Right? And it's also nice that we acknowledge human individuality and human, right, uniqueness, both in stages, in developmental stages, and just in diversity. And so there you go. So that's how we perceive God. Some of the basics, right? So let's review, and then we'll try to encourage us all, including myself, to kind of go through a little exercise to internalize the session. Right. So number one was, well, let's actually review for a second. Right. We're not forced or coerced to believe one thing, one credo. Israel means that we struggle and we wrestle with our own, each individual in Israel, right? In Bnei Israel, in the children of Israel, every child of Israel is asked to go through that same process of struggling with God, right, and coming up with their own relationship with God. Right? That's why that's who we are. We're wrestlers with God. Shema Yisrael. Here's a couple of pointers. Here's what we do. Here's our framework. One is that we don't make a distinction between forces of the universe. It's all one source, one force. That thing, that the cosmos is whatever. We're stardust, right? Whatever is in the cosmos, that same theological, mysterious energy that's out there in the cosmos is the same one that's in our own souls. The same thing when we wonder about God, when we explore our own mind and our own mystery. That's the same cosmic energy as out there in space. So we believe in God as both that's the power of the oneness, both transcendent and close and imminent. And in fact, there are 49 names of God that are commonly used, another 100 or two that are used once in a while. So there are, so many ways we can engage with God. Names mean the way we engage with someone, right? So if we give someone a nickname, it means we're close. If we call them by their full name, it means that we're being stern, right? What we call people, right, defines how we're feeling about them, about their relationship. Sweetheart means that we're feeling tender, right? Yedid Nefesh, right, means that we're feeling tender because Shabbat's about to start, right? And so what we call God matters, right? And that's how we access God and can relate to God and invite God into our lives, is through the power of names, of naming God, of naming this moment, of acknowledging God. And that's up to us. We do that. We do that work, right? Adam did that work in the Garden of Eden, is our tradition. Adam went around and gave everybody names. Everybody needs a name, right? Because we have to start talking to each other and relating to each other. You need a name, right? And these are some of the names of God so that we can relate to God, right? And we relate to God in so many different ways, is the Jewish way, right? And all its paths lead to God, right? And we can, right, the young do it this way, and the infants do it this way, and the elders do it yet another way, right? And this group, the Hasidim, do it this way, and the Lubavitch do it that way, and the Reform do it this way, and the Conservative do it that way, and they are all paths towards God. And so the exercise that the curriculum put together is they're showing us 100-word theologies. You have 100 words to express your theology, right? And so that's the exercise that we'll do. We'll start today, right? And you can take home and finish. Let's read a couple and then get the idea. 100-word theologies. Let's start with, how about Rabbi Deborah Silver? Here we go. I continuously fall in and out of relationship with God. A word I dislike for being too small. She doesn't like the name God for God because it's just too small for her. When I feel most alienated, I often find I've been using unhelpful metaphors. Hero, king, father. Sometimes changing them helps. Mystery, compassion, warrior. But even they fall short. As my interfaith study partner taught me to say, the living God has moved on. The name can never be pronounced. I try to ask, where is God in all this? There have been some moments when I have seen or felt or trusted, and I can live off the energy of those for a long time. So here you see a woman really struggling with faith. And even so that her co-religionists are saying, you know what, I'm sorry, you can't access God like we used to back in the day, back when our ancestors talked to God and our prophets saw visions of God. We just can't. The living God has moved on. Now we can study about God, we can pray to God, but we can't right? And but sometimes maybe we can. Sometimes we can, and there are moments, and those moments are what fuels me. It's a little sad. I didn't love that one. Let's try Rabbi Creditor. He's a little more upbeat. God is the collective potential of the human imagination. That's nice. God is the collective potential of the human. I think it's a lot for me. I'll editorialize. It's a little limiting. Okay, saying God is blank is limiting for me. But here's Malcolm Creditor. God is the collective potential of the human imagination. Every good thing every person has ever yearned for and will ever yearn for is what I mean by the word God. God is the collective yearning of the universe. My God doesn't send cancer or hurricanes or people to hurt others. When a person dies, a fragment of divine potential is lost. When I ask God to embrace my lost loved one, I cry to my community that every life matters. I love you means that I am not alone, and I am here so that you need not be alone either. That for me is God. Yeah, it doesn't quite work for me either. Yeah. So you have to write your own. That's the point here. Yeah. So everybody has to write their own 100-word theology. Right. That's your homework. Yeah. So let's do. How about two more? Okay. Yeah. It has two more. Okay. Rabbi Brad Hirschfield. Well, let's do Rabbi Kligfeld. All right. I believe in God. There you go. I believe in God. And he's a very faithful rabbi. Right? So their faith, I mean by faithful is full of faith. I mean that literally, right? Full of faith. Faithful means full of faith. And then there are wrestling rabbis, and there are critical rabbis, and there are angry rabbis, all kinds, right? In terms of theology. I believe in God. More than I believe that God commands, I believe that God has a commanding voice, heard through our texts, our nation's narrative, and through humanity's shared consciousness. So I believe that God commands us through the Torah, through the texts, through the books. That's God that I believe in. I don't know about God sitting in a chair commanding, right? But in a Captain Kirk. But I do believe that God has a voice, and that voice, I can hear that voice through the texts. The voice commands us universally to care for each other and care for the earth and her inhabitants. The voice commands us particularly to care for Torah and build a worthy Jewish life. Living with mitzvot attuned to godliness is not slavishness, it's loving devotion. It's not coercion, it's loving devotion, it's loyalty, it's friendship, it's relationship. We fail at it almost as much as we succeed. And we stay committed because the bond is that dear. I believe that God was at Sinai, but more importantly, I know that we were at Sinai and we listened and we wrote it down and we have it. We captured that moment at Sinai, right, in the Torah. And good for you, Rabbi Kligfeld. Okay. Good. Let's do Rabbi Spitz. Here we go. Rabbi Eli Spitz. Dear God, right? So I'm reading it because that's another way to do it, right? So just say, Dear God, and check in with God about your relationship. Even if your belief is not simple, right? You can still just pretend for a moment for an exercise and say, Dear God, as if you're writing a letter to God. Our relationship is more grounded in emotion and intuition than analytic thought. I call on you to express my yearnings, my fears, my gratitude, and with such words, I feel closer to you because I believe that you care and listen. I pray to you each day as an act of discipline, a way to make time for our relationship and to express my identity as a Jew. There is little, if anything, that I can say about you, for you are other. And yet, I do believe that you are the consciousness embedded in all that exists, uniting and guiding. So I can't say anything about you because I don't know anything about you, says Rabbi Spitz. But there is one thing I do believe, that you are the consciousness You are the consciousness embedded in all that exists. So what's God, according to Rabbi Spitz? Consciousness. That's God. So yeah, try to wrap our heads around that. So that's Rabbi Spitz's theological opinion. I think it's here and clear. God equals consciousness. Anytime anyone is connecting to consciousness, that's God, right? That's all, you know. To me, God is. To me, God isn't. Some of my questions about God are, right? So that's some prompts, right, for us to begin that writing process. And it'll be due next week. So you won't have to share them, but you can if you'd like. So under 100 words, right? It has to be your own. Although feel free to, you know, search about the internet for some other ideas about what is God, or understandings of God, or definitions of God. That could be interesting. So let's stop here for a moment. Questions, comments? That was a lot of God talk. Yeah. Unmute for a moment. Unmute, Charles. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. One thing that really came to my mind, why did they say 49 names of God? Is it 7 times 7? Is
Yeah.
it the 7 days?
Yeah. So I think 49 is a number, as a sacred number, right? And 49 comes up. There are 49 levels of purity and impurity. There are 49 days between that we count the Omer, right? And so the number 49, I think, is associated with purity. So I think that's probably where it came from.
That's troubling to me. But in terms of the belief in God, I think that when you look at it independently and looking outside, what the statistics show is that Jews, or in Judaism, if you do all of the 613 commandments and you respect the Shabbat, then you are Jewish no matter what, whether you want it or not. And when you are Jewish, born Jewish, you never lose it. And Hitler knew that, okay?
That's right.
The Christians is much more sophisticated, but much weaker, because Jesus came and took the sins. And therefore, if you believe in Jesus, you have grace. So why shouldn't I believe if it's that's easy?
Right.
And then the Muslims,
that's one of the strengths. Yeah.
And the Muslim is extreme, that you don't believe, you're not Allah, I'm going to kill you. Right. Jew, Christian, it doesn't matter.
There were times that happened, yeah.
I mean, it doesn't probably explain the existence of God or not, but a Jew does not need to believe in God to be Jewish. And in Israel, 70% of them don't believe it.
Right.
And they are Jewish and Zionist and whatever you want.
Yeah, so it's very liberal in that sense. And
the idea, I believe, is a question of freedom. We just celebrated Pesach. The real word of what Pesach is freedom. And we want, even socially, and that's why a lot of Jews helped the blacks when they wanted to have, is to be free, to believe or not. And and that's a very important idea.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
In the world where we live, when you call about democracy and whatever, you have freedom. You have the freedom of choice. Freedom of speech.
I think that's really important.
But in the other structures, like whether it's materialism with communism or not, then that's it,
Right, right. Yeah, I think that's underappreciated part of Judaism is the freedom to believe or not believe. Right, there's
Yeah.
no coercion to believe, and organically. There is kind of socially coming from the right wing places, but not organically from the Torah. I think yes,
Yeah.
or from rabbinics. If not from the Torah, it's they want everybody to listen to God's voice.
Well, na'aseh v'nishma.
Right, right, right. To do right. The more important thing, as we know, is to behave.
But nishma is very important. When we listen to the Torah,
Right,
we want to absorb it, to make it live.
right.
You
But
know,
it's
we
clear,
cannot just not listen and just act and whatever, you know.
right? It's clear that
You
behavior.
have to receive the message, but then you do whatever you want with the message.
Right. Well, they'll be right in terms of your belief, but there's a behavioral expectation of kindness and love and right. But what you believe behind it, that's up to you, right? But
Yeah. Yeah.
and so yeah, we're proud of Judaism in that sense, and that's a great strength. The right, but the challenge, of course, the flip side of that is that it's a little loose, right? So we lose people to assimilation and to
Yeah.
just disinterest, because it's perceived as a lack of passion, right? The looseness, I think, is right. Just it's hard to right. It's hard to be a fiery, charismatic leader for centrism and liberal causes, but that's our challenge, right? That's what we have to do. Right? It's easy to yell and scream, right, about extreme causes. Right? It's harder to yell and scream about sort of sensical, moderate centrism. But that's the challenge, right? Is to really make this claim that that freedom is the ultimate cause here, and religions need to be able to handle more diversity and freedom.
Yeah. Judaism has evolved throughout history. When we say king, melech, whatever, at that time, the melech was melech. And in France, the kings were descendant of God, basically, that they were, you know.
Yeah.
Whereas, there is a very funny story, or not funny, but very, very quick, that there are two rabbis that are really hachamim, completely. And they start arguing whether God exists or not. One says yes, one says no, one says that, but here, but that. And then they don't come to a conclusion and they go to sleep. And when they wake up in the morning, having basically abandoned the object of defining and whatever, one looks at the other one who is putting the talit and the tefillin and says, so why do you do that? So, well, I've done that all my life. I'm going to continue.
Right. Because I'm a Jew. Right.
Exactly. It's just a way of life.
Right.
Rabbi, before you go, I was thinking about a school situation that I had in high school. So we were talking about Greek gods and goddesses and stuff like that, and the way I was spelling it was the lowercase God and stuff like that. And I'm like, oh my God, I can't do that because the way we spell it sometimes is the capital G dash C and stuff like that. And I'm like, what am I supposed to do? I can't put this paper on the ground and I can't turn this paper in. And I'm like, and I talked to my teacher and I'm like, and I think we actually called you or Rabbi Goldstein or something. And he said, no. And he said, no, it's okay. As long as it's for an assignment, it's okay. And I'm like, and now I know that it's okay.
That's right. And lowercase g is right, not our God. So
right. That's what I'm saying. As long as it's not our God that I'm talking about, it's fine.
It's literally good. Well, thank you everybody for participating. You have your homework assignment and 100 words or less. on your relationship with God, your wrestling match with God. And
That'll
so,
give me something to do.
yes, I wish you much luck in your competition. And,
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks.
come out a winner.
Thank
Bye.
you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
See you soon.